Okay, I'm Greg Wasilkoff. I'm professor of anthropology at the University of South Alabama and an archaeologist, one of the directors of this project here at Holy Ground, the excavation of a Creek War battlefield site. The Creek War occurred in 1813-1814, and it was one of the first battles was at Fort Mims, which is a famous site in South Alabama. And some of the people who attacked that site came from this site, which is Holy Ground. Chaka, it was the Red Stick Creek's Prophet's Town, one of the religious movement centers of the Civil War that the Creeks had at that time. And the site was attacked in December of 1813 by an American army composing of Mississippi Territorial Militia, which would have been people from Alabama and Mississippi at the time down in the south. And they attacked this town. There was a fairly brief battle. A few people killed on each side, and eventually the Red Sticks retreated across the Alabama River, and the Americans and their Choctaw allies burned the town. So the town site is really remarkable for a couple of reasons. One is that it was only occupied for about 6 months, and then destroyed suddenly, and so it's sort of like a little Pompeii, a little kind of a site that has a short existence and isn't reoccupied later on, which is very useful for archaeologists to study. And then, of course, it was the sacred ground of the Red Stick Creeks, and so it's important to descendants of the Creeks and to people interested in early American history. We first found this site in 2011. It had not really been located on the ground, although people have generally known where Holy Ground was. It's very famous in Alabama history because William Weatherford, one of the Red Stick Creek leaders, made a famous jump off the bluff over on the Alabama River during his escape from the American Army at that time, and he's quite a mythic character in Alabama history. So the his ties with Holy Ground make the site even more interesting. So the site turned out to be about a half mile from the river where Weatherford made his famous jump, and it had never been plowed, never really occupied by any kind of farming community. Nobody's really done anything here since 1813, and that's an ideal kind of situation for archaeology because the site is really very much intact. The log buildings, of course, decayed long ago, and many of them were burned during the battle, but apart from that, everything that lays in the ground has remained there ever since. Right now we're excavating one of the log cabin houses, and one of the surprising discoveries of this year's dig was the very intact remains of the hearth, the area of the chimney off to one side of this cabin. And these kinds of creek houses have never been found before archaeologically, so we're trying to understand how they were made. They do seem to differ in several ways from American-style log cabins of the time. Hearth of a creek log cabin, and the inner wall of the cabin would have been right out in front of this clay. This orangish clay has turned orange because it was a place where fires were burning for probably continuously for about 6 months. It tends to change the nature of the soil. And so the log house would have gone off to my right, and this then jutted out on one end of the cabin. And it would have had a wall around the perimeter here, kind of a stick and mud wall, so the chimney would rise up in this area. And so this is actually the hearth, the cooking surface inside the house, an opening toward that direction into the kitchen area of the house. And so we don't find a lot here, but this is quite an unusual kind of hearth. It's not the sort of thing that American settlers would have built. It's very much a creek a feature combined with a European style of architecture. So it's an interesting combination of the two. This replica pot, this is a modern copy of what the creek pots looked like at the time, back in 1813. And this is based, in fact, on several sherds we found around, I guess, in 2012 when we were excavating out here. So it's a style exactly of the time and place. Here's a sherd we found just a few days ago that essentially matches this kind of pot. So we know this is, again, this is the same style of pottery, and it's largely used for cooking sofki, which is the kind of fermented corn soup that the Creeks made and still make. And it's a very ancient kind of recipe for making a very basic staple dish that the Creeks ate for many centuries. So very important style of pot. We find these everywhere on all Creek sites, and largely we just find little fragments of them. But to find large sherds, such as the one I just showed you here, is quite rare, and pretty exciting for us to be able to find big pottery sherds like that. So anyway, if you can imagine the household and the hearth, particularly with these kind of set around for cooking, that's pretty much what the interior of these log cabins would have looked like. Elsewhere, we're in this excavation area, we're finding various kinds of pits in the ground. These probably were originally dug for a couple of reasons. One would be to get clay to make pottery and to build up the hearth and chink the logs of a cabin. And then afterwards they would be used as places to dump household refuse as they lived at the site. So what we find is lots of artifacts in the bottoms of these pits, including particularly lots of broken pottery. Pottery is just fragile and tended to break fairly often, so it is a fairly common kind of artifact. But what we're seeing here is that, again, because the site is only occupied for about 6 or 7 months, there's not a lot of mixing of the artifacts. Pots that broke, largely the pieces are still in the same vicinity, so we can restore them and hopefully show intact vessels or nearly intact vessels when we get done studying them in the laboratory. So this is the remnants of the clay hearth. It would have been kind of jutting out from the log cabin, which was turning over here. The log cabin's very small. It's about 11 by 12 feet in 2 dimensions there, and maybe 8 feet tall, something like that. So very small cabin, but off the end of the cabin they would have had this stick and mud chimney projecting out. And so from the inside you kind of reach into the cooking area, and that's the surface right there. It was a nice prepared clay surface. What we're seeing back here is actually the back of the chimney. It's the outside of it. And there was a log sitting here that created these impressions. There's bark impressions right here, and another log laying right in there. And so they kind of stacked these up, crisscrossed them, and ended up building a big crib around the hearth area. And when the house burned in December 23rd in 1813, when the Americans burned the town, these kind of buildings were destroyed by fire, but it also then preserved this evidence of how the various parts of the building were constructed. So here we have actually a clay wall remnant that would have come up here on the back of the fireplace area, and this would form the outside of the chimney. That was dug by the Creeks probably right as soon as they arrived here sometime in May or June of 1813, when they began to build their houses. And house construction needed two things: a lot of wood for the cabins, and then a lot of clay for the hearth and for chinking, for filling in around the logs. When you build a log house, there's all kinds of gaps, and by winter time you'd be freezing in a log house, so you have to fill that all in with clay. And so they needed a lot of clay. They probably also needed clay to make pottery, so they had all kinds of purposes to dig a pit like this. And once the pit was excavated, you have this big hole next to the house, and typically trash would be thrown into that. It makes it a handy place to dispose of garbage. In this case, they didn't seem to have done that. We haven't found the location where the trash ended up, and so there's actually very little in it, and the pit was visible just as we see today. Here is a big depression in the ground, so it's an unusually obvious example of a clay pit on this site.